In a muddy corner of a broken-down pen, nestled against the cold, still body of their mother, two newborn piglets shivered in the early morning chill. Their tiny, striped bodies were no bigger than a man's hand, all pink skin and desperate, frantic noise. A rancher stood over them, his shadow falling across the grim scene. His name was John, and his own life was a testament to what the land could take from a man. His hands, calloused and worn from a lifetime of labor that had yielded little, clenched at his sides. He was a man who knew the cost of things, who measured his own survival in sacks of grain and the dwindling number of cattle in his far pasture. To take on two more mouths to feed, two creatures so fragile a cold snap could end them, was a kind of madness. The sow lay on her side, taken by a sudden illness in the night. She was just another loss on a ranch that seemed to specialize in them. The choice was clear, the math was simple. Walk away. Let nature have its way. It was the practical thing, the only sensible thing for a man whose pockets were lined with dust, and whose future was a question mark etched into the dry earth. He could turn his back, mend the fence that was always falling down, and try to forget the high, thin sound of their cries. But as he stood there, the smaller of the two piglets, the one with a single white sock on its front foot, lifted its head. It didn't have the strength to stand, but it looked right at him, its little snout twitching, its eyes dark pools of pure need. It was a silence that asked a question his own heart had forgotten how to answer. This wasn't about sense. It was about something older, something buried deep beneath the layers of hardship. A man can lose his land, his money, his hope, but to walk away from a creature that has nothing, that costs a different kind of currency. He knelt in the mud, the damp immediately soaking through the knee of his worn trousers. He gently gathered the two tiny, squirming bodies into the rough canvas of his jacket. They were shockingly light, all frantic energy and delicate bone. He cradled them against his chest, a pocket of fragile life against the worn flannel of his shirt. The choice was made. He had just shouldered a burden that could break what was left of him. And as he turned toward the warmth of his cabin, he carried with him the first mystery of many. How could these, the weakest of all creatures, ever repay such a debt? The cabin door closed behind him, sealing out the sharp morning air. Inside, the silence was different. It was no longer the empty quiet of a man alone, but a space now charged with the soft, desperate sounds of two lives depending on his. He laid his jacket, with his precious, squirming cargo, near the wood stove. The fire inside was banked low, just embers breathing heat into the single room that was his entire world. He stoked it gently, adding a split log he could ill afford to burn during the day. The piglets needed warmth, more than he needed to save the fuel. His life was a ledger of such calculations, every column etched in red. The ranch was 40 acres of stubborn clay and thinning grass, a legacy from his father that felt less like an inheritance and more like a sentence. The barn roof sagged under the memory of better winters. The fence lines were a patchwork of repairs upon repairs, holding back the wilderness through sheer persistence. His herd, what was left of it, was a dozen scrawny cattle that seemed to exist just to test the limits of his patience and his wire. He woke each day before the sun to mend what had broken in the night, to haul water from the creek when the pump failed, which was often, and to fight a battle against dust and debt that he was slowly, surely losing. The first night was a lesson in improvisation and exhaustion. He had no proper bottle, no used milk or replacement formula. He sacrificed an old leather work glove, cutting the fingers into crude nipples and rigging it to a glass jar. He warmed milk from his last cow over the stove, testing the temperature on his wrist like he'd seen mothers do in town, a gesture that felt foreign and profoundly sad in his empty home. They were clumsy at first, refusing the strange rubber, but hunger is a fierce teacher. The bolder of the two, a solid little barrow with a curious snout, finally latched on, his tiny tail whirling in a frantic circle of success. The smaller one, the one with the white foot, needed more coaxing, her nature more watchful, more delicate. He sat on the hard-packed floor for what felt like hours, his back against the warm stove, until both bellies were full and they slept in a pile on his jacket, their breath even and deep. Their personalities emerged as quickly as their strength. The boy was all curiosity and blunt force, sniffing at bootlaces, trying to nibble on loose threads of the rag rug, charging at shadows. He was the first to escape the makeshift pen of stacked firewood, his stout body surprisingly determined. John started calling him Brick for his solid build and his habit of bumping into things. The girl was quieter, her eyes missing nothing. She learned the sound of his footsteps, the creak of the door, and would watch him from a safe distance, processing the world from the shelter of a shadowed corner. She was Whisper. The cost was immediate and sharp. The milk he fed them was milk he didn't sell. The time spent tending to them was time not spent patching the roof or clearing the choked irrigation ditch. He found himself talking to them as he moved around the cabin, explaining his chores, muttering about the price of feed, his voice a low rumble that they seemed to find comforting. It was the first time he'd spoken aloud in that house without it being a curse thrown at a broken tool or the weather. The silence had been broken, and in its place was a fragile, one-sided conversation that somehow made the emptiness feel less absolute. He knew it, couldn't stay a secret. In a place where every piece of news was a currency traded for attention, his strange compassion would be the talk of the town. He could already picture the looks at the general store, the slow, deliberate blinking from behind Harold's counter when he bought extra milk, the cautious, measuring stare from the sheriff, the outright scorn from men like Old Man Prescott, who owned the land to the north and saw kindness as a weakness to be exploited. They were coming. The world outside his fragile sanctuary would soon press in, and his choice to save these two small lives would be weighed and found wanting by everyone who didn't have to hear their quiet breathing in the dark. The news traveled not with a shout, but with a slow, quiet seep, like water finding the lowest point in the land. It started with Harold at the general store. John came in for that third can of milk in as many days, and Harold's eyes, magnified behind his thick spectacles, didn't miss a thing. He didn't ask, just rang it up with a slow, deliberate press of the register key, his silence louder than any question. But his wife, Mabel, was at the post office counter, and her hearing was sharper than her husband's sight. She caught the specific rattle of those cans going into John's burlap sack, noted the weary set of his shoulders, the mud still dried on his knee. By that evening, over a supper of stew and fresh bread, she mentioned it to the postmaster's wife. And just like that, the knowledge was loose. It reached the sheriff 2 days later. Dan Morrison heard it from his deputy, who'd heard it from a ranch hand who'd stopped for tobacco. The sheriff was a practical man, his world governed by ordinances and the simple, hard logic of cause and effect. He found John mending a section of fence along the main road, the 2 piglets rooting in the dirt nearby, already growing, their strange little shadows stretching in the afternoon sun. Morrison leaned against his truck, his hat pulled low. "John," he said, his voice even, without malice, "heard you took on some new hands." John kept working the pliers, twisting the wire. "Something like that." The sheriff watched Brick charge at a grasshopper, his little body a torpedo of enthusiasm. "You know how folks talk. They see a wolf. They don't wait to see if it's a dog. Just something to think on." It was a warning, gently delivered. A man barely keeping his own head above water doesn't need extra weight. The law saw a potential problem, a distraction from survival. Then came Martha Prescott. Her arrival was an event, her husband's truck kicking up a plume of dust that announced her long before it crunched to a stop at the end of John's drive. She didn't get out, just lowered the window, her face a mask of polite disapproval under a wide-brimmed hat. She looked past John, her gaze settling on the pigs like they were a troubling stain on her view. "John Henley," she said, her voice carrying the cool authority of inherited land and good credit. "I hear you're running an orphanage." He just stood there, shovel in hand. "Just trying to keep them alive, Mrs. Prescott." She offered a thin, humorless smile. "We're all just trying to keep alive, John. Some of us by working smarter, not softer. Those things will root up your land, attract predators. They're a luxury a place like this can't afford." She didn't wait for a reply. The window hummed up, and the truck turned around, leaving him standing there in its dust cloud, the truth of her words settling over him heavier than the dirt. At the town council meeting, it became official business. Old Man Henderson, who ran the feed store, brought it up under new business, his voice dripping with scorn. "Wasting good milk on shoats that'll never amount to bacon? It's a disgrace. A man letting sentimentality override sense is a danger to himself and his neighbors." A few heads nodded in the stuffy room. John wasn't there to hear it. He was home, feeding the pigs their evening milk, but the verdict reached him anyway, carried by the few who thought he should know how deep the ridicule ran. He felt their eyes on him every time he went to town now. The cautious glance from the sheriff, the outright mockery from the men loitering outside the hardware store, the pitying looks from the women who saw another sign of a man slowly coming undone. They'd labeled the pigs a nuisance, a symptom of his failure. They saw the extra trips for milk, the time not spent on profitable work, and they shook their heads. They didn't see Whisper learning the sound of his whistle. They didn't see Brick standing his ground against a barn cat 10 times his size. They saw a burden. He tightened his grip on the sack of feed he couldn't really pay for and walked back to his truck, their laughter a faint echo behind him. His resolve didn't break. It hardened, turning inward. If they were going to survive, the pigs and him, it wouldn't be because of this town. It would be in spite of it. It would be right here, on this hard piece of land, on his terms. The rhythm of his days changed, bent and reshaped around their needs. The sun wasn't just a marker for his own labor anymore. It was a clock for their hunger. He woke to their impatient squeals, a sound that had replaced the hollow silence of his dawns. The first task was no longer coffee, but the warming of milk, the careful pouring into the jar and glove contraption that had become the most important tool on the ranch. They'd press against his legs as he worked, their solid warm bodies a constant grounding presence. Brick would grunt and nudge at his hand, a demanding little general, while Whisper would wait, her intelligent eyes tracking his every move, learning the ritual. He built them a proper pen off the side of the cabin, using leftover lumber and wire mesh, a small fortress against the world's dangers. But they hated it. Their freedom, once they'd tasted it, was a constant craving. Brick became an escape artist of surprising ingenuity, figuring out how to lift the latch with his snout, or simply ramming the weaker boards until they splintered. More often than not, John gave up and let them follow him. Their world became the dusty yard, the shade under the porch, the cool earth by the water pump. He'd be fixing the handle on the well, and he'd look down to find them both there, asleep in a patch of sun, side by side, their breathing synchronized. They were no longer just creatures he was keeping alive. They were there, a part of the landscape of his life. He started with a simple 2-note whistle. something sharp and clear he could make without fingers. At first, it was just noise. But he'd whistle before he poured their milk, before he scattered kitchen scraps for them to root through. Cause and effect. Brick caught on first, his head snapping up at the sound, his whole body quivering with anticipation before he'd come barreling across the yard. Whisper was more cautious, always watching Brick's reaction first, confirming the signal was safe before she'd trot over, her steps more deliberate. Within a week, they both came, a two-pig stampede that ended at his boots, snouts uplifted, waiting. He found himself talking to them constantly. Not the muttered curses of before, but actual conversation. He'd explain what he was doing as he patched the fence, his voice a low, steady monologue about tension and post holes. He'd tell them about the weather, the price of beef, the stubbornness of his old tractor. They'd listen, or seem to, Brick snuffling at the tools, Whisper sitting quietly, her head cocked. It was a madness, he knew, talking to pigs. But the sound of his own voice in the empty air didn't feel so lonely when it was answered by a contented grunt or the rustle of straw as they settled nearby. The cabin, once just a place to sleep, became a home again. The firelight at night didn't just illuminate an empty chair. It danced over their sleeping forms in the corner, and the warmth in the room was more than just from the stove. There were moments of pure, unexpected light. One afternoon, wrestling with a seized bolt on the plow, his knuckles bloody and his temper frayed, he let out a furious groan of frustration. Brick, startled from his investigation of a beetle, looked up, let out a comically loud snort, and then charged headfirst into the flat tire of the plow, bouncing off with a surprised oink. John stared for a second, then a sound came out of him that was rusty and unfamiliar. Laughter. It was just a startled chuckle at first, then it grew, deep and real, washing away the frustration. He laughed until his sides ached, and the pig, looking mildly offended, shook his head and trotted away. It was the first time he'd laughed on this land in years. But the land itself never let you forget its harshness for long. The days grew shorter, the nights bitingly cold. The blue skies of autumn began to bruise with the gray of coming winter. The hope that had started to bud was fragile, a tender shoot that wouldn't survive a hard frost. He'd watch the dark clouds gathering over the distant mountains and feel a familiar dread settle in his stomach. The struggle to keep them alive through the summer had been one thing. Keeping them alive through a Montana winter would be something else entirely. The warmth inside the cabin felt like a tiny, fragile bubble, and outside, the wind was already starting to whisper of the deep cold to come. The true test was gathering on the horizon, and it would take more than milk and a warm stove to see them all through it. The storm didn't roar in. It crept. It began as a sharpness in the air, a metallic taste on the wind that promised something brutal. The sky turned the color of a fresh bruise, a deep uniform gray that swallowed the mountains whole. John felt it in the old ache in his shoulder, a better predictor than any almanac. He spent that day in a frantic race, battening down what he could. He secured tarps over the woodpile, moved the last of the tender vegetables into the root cellar, and checked the cabin's chinking for drafts. The pigs felt it too. Their usual rambunctious energy vanished, replaced by a quiet unease. They stuck close to his heels as he worked, not begging for attention, just needing the reassurance of his presence. Whisper, especially, was restless, her head constantly raised, sniffing at the charged air, her whole body tense with a knowledge deeper than his own. The first flake started at dusk, not gentle and drifting, but driving sideways on a wind that screamed around the corners of the cabin. Within an hour, the world beyond the window was a swirling white void. The temperature plummeted. The fire in the stove, which he'd kept roaring all day, seemed to shrink back against the cold. pressing in from the walls. He could feel the icy breath of winter seeping through the floorboards. This was no simple snowstorm. It was an assault. The old cabin groaned and shuddered under the onslaught. He knew the pen outside would be a death trap. There was no choice. He brought them inside, herding their reluctant, nervous bodies through the door. They huddled together on the rag rug, confused by the howling wind and the strange intimacy of being in his space. The night became a battle fought in shifts. He'd stoke the fire until the iron stove glowed cherry red, then collapse into his chair for a few minutes of exhausted sleep, only to be jolted awake by a deeper cold or a particularly violent gust that threatened to tear the roof right off. The pigs were silent, a single shivering mass of warmth against his legs. Their fragility was a physical weight on his chest. Every gust of wind was a reminder of the sow in the pen, of how quickly life could be stolen by the cold. He wasn't just fighting for his ranch anymore. He was fighting for theirs. His own survival was tied to the steady rising and falling of their sides. In the flickering firelight, their sleeping forms mirrored his own precarious existence on this land. A tiny pocket of warmth and life holding out against a vast, indifferent cold. Near midnight, a sound cut through the storm's roar that was different from the wind. A sharp crack, then a groan of rending wood from behind the cabin. The water trough. He pulled on his frozen coat and fought his way outside. The wind stealing his breath, the snow blinding him. The trough, swollen with ice, had split clean open. His precious water supply was glazing the ground in a sheet of black ice. It was a disaster. In this cold, without water, the cattle. He was already calculating the loss, the impossibility of hauling enough water from the creek for them all, when he heard it. A frantic, high-pitched squealing from inside. He stumbled back in, expecting to find a draft or some new calamity. Instead, he found Brick and Whisper, not by the fire, but over by the far wall, where a hidden leak had sprung from a frozen pipe. They were rooting and snuffling at the base of the wall, their snouts pushing against the wet planks, their squeals pointed and urgent. They weren't just making noise, they were showing him. They had found the problem he couldn't see, drawn by the sound and smell of the water he needed to save. In that moment, they weren't burdens. They were partners. The storm broke after 3 days, leaving a world transformed, silenced, and buried under 2 feet of snow. The stillness was profound. Exhausted, he finally opened the cabin door to let them out. They burst into the dazzling white world, snorting and kicking up powdery clouds, their joy a stark contrast to the exhaustion etched on his face. They weren't fragile anymore. They had endured. He watched them, Brick plowing a comical furrow through the drift, Whisper following delicately in his path, and something shifted inside him, a lock clicking open. The bond was no longer just about his protection of them. It was reciprocal. They had fought the winter with him. They had helped him find the leak. They were, in their stubborn porcine way, keeping the ranch alive, too. The relentless pressure from town, the scorn, it all faded under the pure, clean silence of the snow. They had weathered the storm together. But as he looked out at the pristine landscape, he knew the threats weren't all made of wind and ice. The humankind left tracks, and the snow would make them easy to follow. The snow melted into a thick, clinging mud that seemed to suck at the very foundations of the place. The temporary peace bought by the storm's aftermath didn't last. The first sign wasn't a person, but a cut. A clean, sharp slice through the wire of his southern fence line, the one that bordered the vast, rolling holdings of Old Man Prescott. It wasn't weather damage. It was deliberate. The cut was too precise. The wire ends curled back with a tool, not snapped by ice or a wandering animal. John stood there, a cold feeling in his gut that had nothing to do with the thaw. He'd mended this same stretch just last week. Someone had waited for the snow to clear, for him to drop his guard, and then they'd come in the night to undo his work. It was a message, quieter than words, but just as clear. Your efforts are meaningless. Your boundaries are not your own. The pressure came officially the next day. A truck, sleek and polished compared to his own rusted machine, spat gravel as it pulled into his yard. It wasn't Prescott himself, but his foreman, a lean man named Crow, with eyes that never quite settled on anything. He didn't get out, just leaned an elbow on the open window frame. "Prescott's noticed you've got livestock that ain't cattle," he said, his voice flat. "Sends his regards. Says pigs are a magnet for trouble. Coyotes mostly, but other things too. Thieves see a man distracted by pets. They see an easy mark. Lets his own herd wander. Creates problems for his neighbors." The threat was veiled in a neighborly concern that was colder than the recent snow. They weren't just a nuisance. They were now a liability, an excuse for Prescott to take action if any of his prized cattle ever went missing. The blame was being pre-positioned, like artillery before a battle. The sheriff's deputy came next, a different kind of warning. A young man named Evans, who wore his authority a little too tight, like a new shirt he wasn't comfortable in. He made a show of looking around the property, his eyes lingering on the pigs who were happily rooting up a patch of thawed earth. "Got a complaint, John," he said, not meeting his eyes. "Nuisance call. Someone saying the smell's carrying, that the noise is disturbing." It was a flimsy pretext, and they both knew it. The nearest house was 2 miles down the wind. "Sheriff just wants me to remind you of the ordinances. Loose livestock, sanitation, that sort of thing." His gaze drifted toward the cut fence line, but he said nothing about it. The message was clearer than Crow's. The law, or its representative, was leaning Prescott's way. The pigs were the handle they could use to grab him, to squeeze him until he either let go or broke. John's resolve didn't break. It calcified. He mended the cut fence with a new piece of wire, his jaw set. Each twist of the pliers was a quiet defiance. He wouldn't surrender them. They had become more than just animals he'd saved. They were a line in the dirt he had drawn around his own life. To give them up would be to surrender a piece of himself to the Prescotts of the world, to admit that their power to dictate his choices was absolute. The harassment was meant to isolate him, to make him feel the weight of his decision. Instead, it bonded him tighter to the two creatures at the center of the storm. They were his to protect, and that purpose was a fire in him that had been banked for years. It was the pigs who first sensed the outsiders. Nights that had been quiet, except for the wind, now held a new tension. Brick, usually a solid sleeper, would suddenly lift his head from his straw bed, his body rigid, a low guttural grumble vibrating in his chest. Whisper would be already awake, a silent shadow at the door, her ears pricked forward, her entire being focused on something in the dark that John's human senses couldn't detect. He'd stand with them in the dark cabin, listening until his ears rang with the silence, straining to hear what they heard. Some nights there was nothing. Other nights, the distant crunch of a footstep on gravel, the soft nicker of a horse being held at a distance. They were being watched. Their restlessness was his early warning system, a primal alarm that someone was moving in the shadows just beyond his lantern light. The tracks he found one morning confirmed it all. Not the sharp, purposeful prints of the deputy's official boots, or the deep tread of Crow's workmen. These were smaller, worn-down boots, the kind a man who didn't want to be identified might wear. They circled the cabin at a distance, pausing at windows, studying the pig pen, and finally leading away into the scrub toward Prescott's land. The snow was gone, but the mud had held the impression perfectly. The threat was no longer vague suspicion or legal maneuvering. It was boots on his ground. It was men in the night. The conflict was shifting, moving from the town square and the sheriff's office onto his land, into his home. The Piglets were no longer just the cause of the trouble. As they stood beside him, sniffing at the foreign tracks with agitated snorts, they became something else entirely. They were the guardians of the threshold, and they were ready for a fight. The first real test came on a night so dark the moon was just a memory behind thick cloud. John was woken not by a sound, but by absence of it. The usual chorus of crickets and night birds had fallen utterly silent. In the corner, both pigs were on their feet. Brick was a statue of tension, his head low, a continuous rumbling growl in his throat that John had never heard before. It was a sound that belonged in a much deeper woods. Whisper was at the cabin's single window, her front hooves on the sill, her snout pressed to the glass, emitting sharp, frantic puffs of air that fogged the pane. They weren't begging for food. This was an alarm. He was out of his cot in an instant, the cold floorboards biting his feet. He didn't light a lamp. He grabbed his father's rifle from its pegs and moved to the window beside Whisper. At first, he saw nothing but the deeper black of the tree line against the night sky. Then, a flicker of movement, a shadow detaching itself from the others, slipping toward his small cattle pen where his dozen scrawny steers were bedded down. Then another, rustlers. They moved, with a practiced quiet, their forms vague and menacing in the dark. His heart hammered against his ribs. They were between him and the herd. To step outside was to walk into an ambush. He was calculating the angle, the risk, his finger cold on the trigger, when Brick solved the problem for him. The pig let out a sound that shattered the night, a high, piercing squeal of pure outrage that cut through the silence like a knife. It was so sudden, so unnerving, that the shadows by the cattle pen froze. In that moment of stunned hesitation, John saw his chance. He threw open the cabin door and fired a single shot into the air. The report was enormous, echoing off the hills. The rustlers scattered, but not toward the trees. One, panicked by the gunshot and the ungodly squealing from the cabin, turned and ran straight toward the sound of the cattle, thinking to use them as cover. That's when Whisper moved. She bolted out the door between John's legs, a pale blur in the darkness. She didn't charge the man. She ran a wide, intelligent flanking route, her small hooves silent on the packed earth, and cut off his retreat toward the woods. She planted herself in his path, a small, determined obstacle, and let out a series of sharp, aggressive barks that sounded nothing like a pig. It was the sound of a guardian. The man pulled up short, confused by the bizarre creature blocking his way. That second of confusion was all John needed. He was on him, the rifle stock catching the man in the shoulder, spinning him around. The other rustler was already gone, swallowed by the night, his partner's horse fleeing after him. The fight went out of the one remaining man the moment he saw the barrel of the Winchester leveled at his chest. He dropped his knife and put his hands in the air, his breath coming in ragged gasps. John stood there, the adrenaline singing in his veins, the pigs at his side. Brick was nudging the downed man with his snout, sniffing him with proprietary disdain, his earlier fury replaced by curiosity. Whisper stood sentinel a few feet away, watching the tree line, ensuring the threat was truly gone. The steers, startled but unharmed, milled about in their pen. In the space of 2 minutes, the entire dynamic of the ranch had shifted. The rustlers had expected a helpless, isolated man. They hadn't expected a coordinated defense. They hadn't expected the pigs. John marched his prisoner to the shed and secured him, his mind racing. The man was just a hired hand, scared and stupid. But the attempt was a declaration. Prescott was testing his defenses, and he'd found them far stronger than anticipated. As the first gray light of dawn crept over the land, John looked at Brick and Whisper. They were rooting around the spot where the struggle had happened, their work done, back to the business of being pigs. But they were different now. They weren't just survivors. They were defenders. The story wouldn't stay quiet. A captured rustler was news. The tale of the squealing pig alarm and the flanking maneuver would spread through the town's gossip mill, warped and exaggerated, but its core truth undeniable. The Burdens had become protectors. The laughingstock had teeth, and everyone would soon know it. The captured rustler didn't stay in the shed for long. By mid-morning, Sheriff Morrison himself arrived, his face a mask of grim officialdom. He listened to John's account with a neutral expression, his eyes occasionally flicking to the pigs who were now dozing in a sun-warmed patch of dirt as if last night's chaos had been a dream. He took the sullen, frightened man into custody with a curt nod. "I'll see what he has to say," was all Morrison offered before driving away, leaving a cloud of dust and a deeper unease in his wake. The sheriff's absence during the actual event, his delayed response, felt less like procedure and more like calculated distance. The gears of something larger were turning, and John had just thrown a wrench into them. The town meeting was called for that Friday night in the Grange Hall, the air thick with the smell of old wood and simmering tension. It wasn't a discussion. It was an inquisition. Martha Prescott sat at the front, her posture rigid, flanked by her foreman Crow and a few other substantial landowners. Sheriff Morrison stood off to the side, his arms crossed, playing the part of the neutral arbiter. John stood alone before them, the weight of their collective judgment pressing down. The story of the rustlers had spread, but Prescott's version had taken root first. He didn't praise the pig's defense. He weaponized it. "The point is not that he stopped a theft," Prescott's lawyer stated, his voice slick and condescending. "The point is that his unconventional pets created the attraction for the theft in the first place. They signaled a vulnerability. They are a disruption, a magnet for the very lawlessness we're all trying to prevent." The argument was insidious, twisting the pig's loyalty into a liability. Other voices joined the chorus, echoing the same fear. The animals were an unpredictable variable in their carefully ordered world of fences and deeds. They were a problem to be solved. The sheriff finally spoke, his tone weary, as if burdened by the whole affair. "John, nobody's questioning your intentions, but the community has a right to security. Perhaps it's time to consider what's best for everyone. Surrender them. Let this be over." John looked out at the faces, some hostile, some merely uncomfortable, few meeting his eyes. He felt the trap closing. To agree was to betray the creatures who had saved his herd. To refuse was to brand himself an enemy of the community. The choice was impossible, a test of loyalty devised by men who understood only power, not bonds. His voice was low, but clear in the hushed room. "They're not pets. They're family. And you don't surrender family." The silence that followed was colder than any winter night. He had drawn his line. The war was now official. It was Whisper who found the proof. A few days after the meeting, her restlessness returned. She kept wandering down to the creek that marked the eastern boundary of his land, snuffling intently at a particular thicket of alder and scrub. John followed her, his curiosity piqued. She wasn't rooting for grubs. She was digging with a focused purpose. Beneath a loose pile of river stones, partially buried in the damp earth, her snout uncovered not a root, but the corner of a metal strongbox. It was locked, but the rust was old. He pried it open with his knife. Inside wasn't treasure. It was a ledger of lies, meticulous records of cattle sales, but the dates and brands didn't match any legitimate market. Bills of lading for shipments that never arrived, and scribbled notes in a tight, familiar handwriting, Prescott's, detailing head counts, prices, and a single damning list of names. Sheriff Morrison's was at the top, followed by a monthly figure that represented his cut for looking the other way. The rustling wasn't just a side business. It was an enterprise, and John's pigs had been the perfect scapegoat for their losses. The betrayal was so complete it stole the air from his lungs. The law wasn't just leaning Prescott's way. It was bought and paid for. He reburied the box exactly as he found it, his hands trembling, not with fear, but with a cold, clarifying fury. He knew what this meant. This wasn't about nuisance animals anymore. This was about silencing a witness who had stumbled upon the truth. Prescott and Morrison couldn't let him live now. He had the evidence that could hang them both. As he walked back to the cabin, the pigs trailing behind him, the quiet of the ranch felt different. It was the calm before a storm of a different kind. The shadows under the trees no longer felt empty. Every creak of a branch was a potential footstep. The conflict had escalated far beyond a dispute over livestock. It was now a battle for survival against men who had everything to lose and a sheriff's badge to hide behind. The stage was set for a confrontation that would leave only one side standing. They didn't wait for nightfall. They came at dusk, in that long, deceptive shadow time when details blur and a man's eyes play tricks on him. John was mending a harness on the porch, the pigs dozing at his feet, when the first shot rang out. It wasn't aimed at him. It was a message. The bullet smacked into the porch post beside his head, splintering the old wood with a crack that echoed across the quiet yard. Instinct, older than thought, took over. He was moving before the echo died, grabbing his rifle, kicking open the cabin door. "Inside!" he barked, and the pigs, startled from their sleep, didn't hesitate. They scrambled through the door, their earlier training overriding their panic. He slammed it shut behind them, dropping the heavy bar into place just as a second shot thudded into the thick timber. Peering through a crack in the shutter, he counted 4 shapes moving through the twilight. Not rustlers this time. These were Prescott's men, hired for a cleaner, more permanent job. They fanned out with a grim professionalism, using the barn, the woodpile, the old tractor for cover. They weren't here to steal. They were here to erase. The sheriff was nowhere to be seen. This was deniable. A tragic incident, a stubborn rancher, a firefight with trespassers, a man and his unfortunate animals caught in the crossfire. The story was already written. They just had to act it out. John's mind, cold and clear now, mapped the yard like a battlefield. He had the cabin, solid walls, a field of fire across the front approach. But they would flank him. They would try to burn him out. His advantages were the land itself, which he knew inch by inch, and his 2 lieutenants, who were now pacing nervously inside, their sharp senses tracking every footfall outside. He gave a sharp, low whistle, 2 short bursts. Stay alert, but hold position. Their restless movements stilled. They understood. The attack came from 2 sides. A fusillade of shots peppered the front of the cabin, meant to pin him down while 2 men worked their way around back toward the unprotected rear window. They were predictable. John ignored the front, moving to the back room. He didn't fire. He waited. He heard the crunch of a boot on gravel, a muffled curse as one of them tripped over a root he knew was there. Then he saw a shadow rise up against the window, the shape of a man holding a kerosene can. Before John could draw a bead, a black and white streak shot out from under the bed. Brick. The pig hit the man at knee level with the force of a battering ram. The man screamed, more in shock than pain, as the can flew from his hands, kerosene splashing across the wall. The window shattered as the man fell back through it, and Brick retreated back into the shadows with a triumphant snort. The element of surprise, his greatest weapon, was now his. Outside, chaos erupted. The second man at the rear, startled by his partner's sudden flight, turned to see what had happened. That was all the opening John needed. A single shot from the Winchester, aimed high and wide, zipped past the man's head. It wasn't meant to kill. It was meant to herd. The man flinched violently, stumbling backward, right into the path of Whisper. She'd slipped out the slightly ajar front door, a pale ghost in the deepening dark, and now she hit him from the side, her smaller body a blur of momentum that knocked his legs out from under him. His head connected with the corner of the water trough with a sickening thud, and he went down and didn't move. 2 down. The shooting from the front stopped abruptly. The remaining 2 men were confused, their clean operation unraveling into a nightmare of unseen attackers and ungodly sounds from the dark. John heard their frantic whispering, the nervous click of a hammer being cocked. He used their hesitation. He moved to the front window, whistled once, a long, sharp blast. "Come to me." He saw Brick immediately burst from the cabin's rear, circling wide around the side of the property, a moving shadow drawing their fire. The men turned toward the noise, rifles coming up, and fired blindly into the gloom. That was their mistake. It gave away their position. John's rifle spoke twice, the shots precise and economical. The first shot took the rifle from the hands of the closer man, the impact spinning him around. The second shot was a warning that kicked up dirt at the feet of the last man standing. "Drop it!" John's voice cut through the sudden silence, raw with authority. "It's over." The man, his nerve broken, let his weapon fall into the dirt, his hand slowly rising. In the ringing quiet that followed, John heard a pained whimper. Not human. He barreled out the front door, his heart in his throat. Brick was lying near the woodpile, a dark stain spreading across his shoulder where a stray bullet had grazed him. The big pig was breathing hard, his sides heaving, but his eyes were clear. He tried to get up when he saw John, letting out a weak, indignant grunt. The fury that washed over John then was colder and more absolute than the coming night. He turned to the 2 captured men, his face a stone mask. "Tell Prescott," he said, his voice low and deadly calm, "the next man he sends onto my land won't be walking off it." It was then that the sheriff's truck finally arrived, its headlights cutting through the dusk, painting the scene in stark relief. The 2 trussed-up men, the third still unconscious by the trough, the fourth nursing his wrist, and John kneeling in the dirt, applying pressure to his pig's wound with a bandana. Morrison got out slowly, his expression unreadable. He looked at the scene, at the evidence of the foiled attack, at the determined man and his wounded defender. The official story had just been rewritten by blood and resolve, and there was no denying the truth of it any more. The battle was over. The war, John knew, was just beginning, but he had won the first, most important ground, the right to stand it. The days that followed were a slow unfreezing. The truth, once it broke, did not come as the explosion, but as a thaw, revealing the solid ground that had been hidden beneath the ice of Prescott's lies. The sheriff, his corruption laid bare by the ledger and the testimony of his own hired men, was taken away not in his own truck, but in the back of a federal marshal's car. The sight of it, watched by the whole town from behind curtained windows and porch rails, was a quiet earthquake. The man who had been the law was now its subject. The Prescotts, their empire built on stolen cattle and intimidation, crumbled into lawsuits and shame, their power evaporating like morning mist. For John, the change was in the eyes that met his. The cautious, measuring looks at the general store were gone. When he walked in now, there was a new silence, but it was one of respect, of a community recalibrating its understanding of the quiet man at the edge of town. Harold, behind the counter, didn't just ring up his order. He leaned in. "Heard what them pigs of yours did," he'd say, his voice low with something like awe. "Smart animals." It was an apology and an acceptance, all in one. The children were the first to approach without fear, drawn by the story of the brave pig that fought off bad men. They'd stand at the edge of his yard, and he'd let Brick and Whisper amble over, their injury and their heroism making them legends instead of nuisances. The healing was a quiet thing. Brick's shoulder wound, clean and shallow, knit itself back together with the stubborn resilience that defined him. John kept it clean, applying a poultice of pine sap and honey, and the big pig bore the tending with a patient grumble, as if annoyed by the fuss but understanding its necessity. Whisper rarely left his side during those days, her watchful eyes seeming to stand guard over her brother's recovery. They had faced the darkness together and emerged on the other side, their bond to each other and to him forged in a fire that could not be broken. The ranch itself began to breathe easier. Neighbors he hadn't spoken to in years stopped by, not with judgment, but with offers. A spare part for the tractor, help repairing the bullet holes in the porch post. It was the language of this land, the unspoken code that had been suppressed by Prescott's reign and was now reasserting itself. They weren't just helping him. They were reaffirming their own community, building it back on a foundation that didn't include fear. John found himself accepting the help, his own stubborn independence softening in the face of their genuine respect. He stood at that same fence line that had been cut, looking out over his land. The cattle were grazing peacefully. The morning sun was warm on his face. Brick rooted contentedly at his boots, his shoulder barely showing a scar, while Whisper sat a few feet away, her ears twitching at the sounds of the waking world. The burden was gone. Not the work of it, that would always be there, but the terrible weight of isolation, of being misunderstood. He had come out here to get away from people, to nurse his losses in solitude. But he hadn't found peace in being alone. He'd found it in the family he had chosen to make, in the loyalty he had earned from two creatures the world had written off. They had protected his home, and in doing so, they had given him back his place in it. The man who had been broken was now whole, not because the land had given him wealth, but because he had found something worth protecting within it. The evening sun cast the field in gold, stretching, their shadows long across the earth. John walked the familiar boundary, not looking for breaks or signs of trouble, but just walking. The air was cool and carried the smell of turned soil and clean wind. At his heels, Brick and Whisper moved with him, their snouts buried in the grass, grunting softly with the simple pleasure of the moment. They weren't heroes or guardians just then. They were just pigs, rooting happily at his boots, a living part of the land they had all fought for. He stopped at the highest point of his pasture, looking out over the small valley he called his own. The cabin with its mended porch, the sturdy pen, the cattle grazing contentedly. It was all there because of a choice made in a muddy pen months ago, a choice that had seemed like the height of foolishness. He reached down and scratched Brick behind the ear, the pig leaning into his hand with a contented sigh. Whisper pressed against his other leg, a solid, warm weight of pure trust. Sometimes strength doesn't arrive with a show of force or a flash of power. It arrives quiet and small in the form of a creature that has nothing to offer but its need. It arrives in the choice to bend down in the mud and pick it up, to shoulder a burden for no reason other than it is the right thing to do. The mightiest things on this earth are not always the loudest. Sometimes they are the quiet bonds we choose to make, the small, defenseless lives we choose to save, and in that saving, we very often save ourselves. If you enjoyed that story of resilience and unexpected loyalty, consider subscribing for more tales from the rural heartland, where the smallest creatures often teach the biggest lessons.